Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. Today in this episode, I'm talking about one of the most exciting revival bands in rock history, a group that proved that 1950s like music could still sound fresh and kind of cool in the MTV era. Now, look, I would be lying my head off if I said the Stray Cats made rock sound dangerous or something like that. I sincerely doubt that many people were afraid of them, aside from the absolute satanic panic sort of religious people out there. But the Stray Cats were a likable band with songs that captured a fun and dynamic retro sound. And who doesn't occasionally like a little bit of retro? I think most people out there do, and if you never have a feeling of nostalgia, I kind of feel sorry for you actually a little bit because that's one of the things that makes music better a lot of the time is because it makes you think of the past. So, this is the story of the Stray Cats, or at least a little quick flashback, if you will, examining what made this band great. And if you've ever heard Rock This Town or Stray Cat Strut, you've already experienced what made this trio special. They didn't simply imitate the pioneers of rock and roll, they took that spirit of rockabilly, injected it with a slight hint of punk and new wave, and introduced it to an entirely new generation. And perhaps the most surprising part of their story is that they became stars in Britain before America really noticed them. And you don't hear about that very often when it comes to like talk of rockabilly, but that's actually true. It wasn't just the American music scene that helped rockabilly succeed. The Stray Cats formed in 1979 in Massapequa, New York. I mangled the pronunciation at first, but let's move on and pretend that didn't happen. But anyway, the classic lineup consisted of guitarist and singer Brian Setzer, upright bassist Lee Rocker, and drummer Slim Jim Phantom. What a name, Slim Jim Phantom. I like that. I think it has a nice vibe to it. And at the time, disco dominated the charts, punk rock was making headlines, and new wave was rapidly becoming the next big thing. And rockabilly, the style pioneered by artists like Eddie Cochran, Carl Perkins, and Gene Vincent, was considered old fashioned by much of the American music industry. A lot of people probably were not poised to give that genre a chance. But the band loved that sound. So instead of trying to chase current trends, they embraced the twangy guitars, slap bass, leather jackets, pompadours, and the raw excitement of early rock and roll. Unfortunately, America wasn't particularly interested, at least not yet. Then the band heard something intriguing. Across the Atlantic, Britain was actually developing a thriving rockabilly revival scene. Clubs were packed with fans who loved vintage American rock and roll. So in 1980, the Stray Cats actually packed up and moved to London. It was a real gamble, and actually it paid off. British audiences immediately embraced them. So it was an action plan that actually had considerable success. Their combination of authentic 1950s style and a little bit of that modern punk energy made them stand out pretty much instantly. They looked like they had stepped out of a time machine, but they sounded loud, fast, and exciting enough to compete with the biggest bands of the early 1980s. Their self titled debut album reached number 6 on the UK albums chart and introduced listeners to what would become one of their signature songs, the Stray Cat Strut, which is a likable song. I kind of challenge you to listen to that and come away with it saying that, oh, I don't understand why anybody would like that song. It's just a likable song in my opinion, and I frankly don't understand the haters. even if it's not necessarily your thing, I think you could still get it. You could still understand the appeal of it. It's just a fun little song. And success overseas eventually caught the attention of EMI America. For American audiences, the label released Built for Speed in 1982, which compiled tracks from the band's British releases. The album became a huge success, eventually going platinum. And suddenly, the United States discovered what Britain already knew. The Stray Cats were something a little bit special. The hits came quickly. You had Rock This Town, the aforementioned Stray Cats Strut, Runaway Boys, which is probably my favorite song of theirs that I've heard. And the next song title is probably going to be a little bit controversial and might even, risk getting them canceled, but it's titled She's Sexy Plus 17. Ooh, you can already hear the people going crazy about that one nowadays. They'd be like, how dare you write a song like that, And I get it. I get it. It's a controversial title, and it's definitely on the taboo side. But that song exists, and you know what? It's it's a decent song, and it's a risque music video too, which makes it even more potentially controversial nowadays. And there was another song called I Won't Stand in Your Way, which is probably my second favorite song by the band that I've heard. I haven't listened to all of their albums, but I've listened to a number of their songs. And each song showcased a slightly different side of the band's personality, from energetic rockers to some smoother ballads. And among them, Rock This Town became especially significant. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would later recognize that song as one of the songs that helped shape rock and roll, which is a fairly remarkable honor for a song released decades after the genre's original heyday. And musically, one thing set the Stray Cats apart from almost everyone else. They were actually just a trio. You had electric guitar, upright bass, drums, no keyboards, no elaborate studio tricks, no walls of overdubs, just three exceptional musicians and maybe some occasional guests, I think that happens on some of their tracks. But for the most part, the core is just the trio. At the center was Brian Setzer. His guitar playing blended rockabilly, blues, country, jazz, and swing into a style that is for a lot of people instantly recognizable. You had you had a fast, sometimes without becoming too flashy. They always played for the song. There was a little bit of technical stuff going on, but without losing emotion. And many guitarists will still regard Brian Setzer as one of the greatest rockabilly players out there. And meanwhile, Lee Rocker's upright bass wasn't simply keeping time, it became part of the visual performance itself, with energetic slap bass techniques and stage antics that recalled the golden age of rock and roll. And Slim Jim Phantom completed the trio with a minimalist drum setup that emphasized groove over excess. It was sort of what the band needed because really at the core of early rock and roll is a sense of simplicity. It's, just getting to the meat and potatoes of what rock music is. And together they proved you didn't need a huge band to create a significant and huge sound. And ironically, the band reached the height of its popularity just as internal tensions were beginning to grow. And isn't that just the way? That seems to happen quite a lot. And popularity kind of does that to people. They might also be frazzled a little bit from touring and creative control. Sometimes, actually, a girlfriend or a wife might be a problem. You hear all sorts of stories, of course. I'm not saying it's true for this band, but for a lot of bands, drug and alcohol use can be figured into it. And like for the band Korn, just as a random example, one of the issues was that one of them became a born again Christian, and he didn't want to be a part of that band anymore. But of course, they did, reintegrate with that member. But it seems like I'm getting sidetracked by talking about Korn. But my point here is just that a lot of these bands, they have something at some point that creates an issue, and it seems like it's going to be the end of the road. And like many successful groups, the members wanted to explore different musical directions. The Stray Cats initially broke up in the mid 1980s, and fortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. They reunited multiple times over the following decades for some tours and new recordings. Brian Setzer found enormous success leading the Brian Setzer Orchestra and really helped spearhead the swing revival of the 1990s, helping bring big band music back into mainstream culture. So basically, Brian Setzer was involved in two different revivals. So the guy has talent, he's got influence and, of course, some sway and some swagger. Lee Rocker and Slim Jim Phantom remained active as performers, collaborators, and ambassadors for rockabilly music. But of course, I've got to be honest, Brian Setzer is sort of at the forefront, and the band's legacy reaches far beyond their record sales. The Stray Cats became the face of the rockabilly revival during the 1980s. Of course, you've got other contenders, but they're really they're really the main ones as far as like recognizability goes. And without them, many younger listeners might never have discovered the music of people like Carl Perkins, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, and the other pioneers who inspired them. They also influenced later styles like neo rockabilly and psychobilly, inspiring countless musicians to blend those vintage sounds with modern energy, and in some cases, a little bit of a horror twist, which is what psychobilly is often about. And they weren't just recreating the past, they proved that classic rock and roll could still feel exciting decades after its birth, and you could occasionally add your own twist to whatever you're creating. And even more than 40 years after their breakthrough, the Stray Cats continue to perform. Following health issues that forced Brian Setzer to cancel the band's 2025 tour, his recovery has allowed the group to announce a return to the stage in 2026, a welcome development for longtime fans. And from what I understand, they're even creating some new songs. So that's great. It's a nice little update. And if you're curious about the band, I'm just going to recommend starting with those essential tracks of Rock This Town, Stray Cat Strut, Runaway Boys, and yes, She's Sexy plus 17. I know. I'm not going to get into that conversation again. I already mentioned enough about that track. And, those songs, they capture why the Stray Cats became a definitive rockabilly revival band and why their music continues to echo with audiences around the world. And sometimes looking backward is exactly how you move music forward. It's a strange thing, but you always are building on what came before. Other people have laid the foundation, and new people come along and they just create something a little bit different out of what happened earlier. And few bands prove that better than the Stray Cats. So I think I've said enough about the band. They're my music recommendation. In addition to Deftones, I recommended them in an episode earlier. And, go ahead and check the Stray Cats out if you haven't already. And thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time, whenever that next time shall be, presumably tomorrow.